They showed up with fake vests, clipboards, and threats convinced they could scare a man into leaving his own home. But what they didn't know was that Commander Isaiah Brooks, a black former Navy SEAL with 20 years of service, was waiting behind that door. What happened next turned a quiet street into a battlefield of truth. Stay tuned, hit subscribe, like, and share this video so more people see what real courage looks like. Just after sundown, when the Carolina sky had softened into deep shades of violet and gold, the kind of light that made the brick houses of the neighborhood glow as if they were alive, Commander Isaiah Brooks stood in his kitchen, rinsing the last plate from dinner. At 48 years old, his routine was simple now. Quiet evenings, a steady rhythm of discipline carried over from his 20 years as a Navy SEAL commander, and the occasional phone call from his grown daughter, who lived a few hours away. He had served around the globe in deserts, jungles, and cities, where every sound meant danger. But here, in Charlotte, North Carolina, the only noise he expected at this hour was the hum of cicadas, or the muffled laughter of children chasing each other down the block. That's why the sound hit him so hard. 3 knocks, not light, not casual, not the knock of a neighbor stopping by for sugar, or the delivery guy dropping a package. No, these were heavy, deliberate, the kind of strikes that carried weight echoing through the frame of his door like a challenge. Isaiah froze, the water still running over his hands, his instincts from decades of service kicking in before his mind even caught up. He shut off the faucet, grabbed a towel, and dried his hands, slowly letting those 3 knocks hang in the air like a warning bell. He'd heard plenty of knocks in his lifetime. In war zones, they weren't on doors, but on armored plates or hatches, sometimes the last sound before everything changed. Tonight, in his quiet home, they carried the same vibration in his chest. He walked down the short hallway to the front door, his boots thudding softly against the hardwood floor, every step steady, controlled, though he could feel his pulse rising. The porch light glowed faintly as he pulled back the blinds just enough to glimpse who had interrupted his evening. 2 men stood there, broad shoulders under tactical vests, radios clipped to their belts, patches across their chests that read, in bold white letters, Special Enforcement Division. Isaiah narrowed his eyes. He'd worn real patches stitched by real units, dirtied by sand and sweat, tested in places most people couldn't even pronounce. He knew what authentic gear looked like, and these didn't carry the same weight. He unlocked the deadbolt with a sharp click, but didn't open the door yet. He wanted to study them first. One of the men was tall, maybe 6'2", with a shaved head, and a long scar dragging down from his eyebrow to the edge of his cheek. His jaw worked side to side like he was chewing his own nerves. The second was shorter, stocky, his arms filling out the vest-mirrored shades perched on his face, even though the sun had already dipped below the horizon. They didn't smile, didn't look neighborly, didn't even look official. They looked like men playing dress-up with authority. Finally, Isaiah opened the door just wide enough to show his frame in the gap. His presence alone filled the space. Broad shoulders, a calm gaze sharpened by decades of experience. The kind of presence that said without words, "This is my ground, and I will not be moved." The taller man spoke first. His voice, rehearsed, too flat, too mechanical. "Mr. Brooks," he said. Isaiah let the silence stretch before answering. "That's me." "You've been found in violation of compliance," the man continued. "By order of the Special Enforcement Division, you're required to vacate this property within 48 hours. Isaiah blinked once slow, then let out a short laugh. Not the kind of laugh born of humor, but the sharp bark of a man who recognized absurdity when he heard it. 48 hours, he repeated. To leave my house. The shorter one stepped forward, his mirrored glasses catching the last trace of light from the setting sun. "That's right. You're out of compliance. We're here to serve notice." His voice was sharper, meant to intimidate, but Isaiah only folded his arms across his chest, the dish towel still draped casually in one hand. He studied them again more carefully this time. Their radios weren't even switched on silent props clipped to their belts. The patches on their vests looked brand new, the stitching too clean, too precise, the kind you ordered off the internet, rather than earned in the field. Their clipboards held flimsy sheets of paper, no official seals, no signatures, nothing that carried the weight of law. "You boys have got to be kidding me," Isaiah said. Finally, his voice steady, quiet, but cutting. "I've been through real inspections, real orders, real authority. This is theater." The tall one's jaw twitched. He leaned in closer, close enough that Isaiah could smell the faint trace of cheap cologne under the sweat. "We're not here to debate. We're here to enforce. You can either walk out quietly, or we can escalate." Isaiah didn't move. He didn't even blink. Years of training taught him the power of stillness, of silence, that unnerved men who thrived on bluster. Inside, his pulse ticked faster, but outside, he was stone. His father used to say, "Real authority never has to raise its voice." And here were two men raising theirs without reason. The shorter one shifted his stance, clearly irritated by Isaiah's calm. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he growled. "Most people would have packed already. Most people don't want trouble." Isaiah let his arms unfold, resting one hand against the frame of the door. His posture relaxed, but coiled like a spring waiting for the right moment. He spoke low, every word measured. "Then you came to the wrong house. Because I don't scare easy. Not in 48 hours. Not in 48 minutes. The tall one smirked a thin, humorless twist of his lips. "Oh yeah? You gonna call the cops? Tell them the Special Enforcement Division knocked on your door. Go ahead, see how fast they show up for that." Isaiah's jaw tightened, not from fear, but from anger. He knew then this wasn't just some prank. This was a setup, a scam, a performance designed to shake him, to make him believe he stood alone against authority that didn't even exist. He glanced past them toward the street. The neighborhood was quiet. A lawnmower buzzed faintly in the distance. A dog barked a few houses down, but here on his porch, the air was heavy, tense, thick with the weight of confrontation. "Let me ask you something," Isaiah said, leaning forward now, his own voice sharp enough to cut. "Who sent you? What division do you report to? What statute am I supposedly breaking?" The shorter one adjusted his sunglasses, buying time, but said nothing. The taller one only shifted his weight and repeated, "Last warning, Mr. Brooks." 48 hours. Isaiah stepped fully onto the porch, then closing the distance until he stood just a few feet from them. His shadow stretched across the boards, long and unyielding. "You picked the wrong door," he said, his voice flat, certain. "I've spent 2 decades leading men, in places you couldn't survive for 2 days. I know the sound of real authority, and it doesn't sound like you." For the first time, the taller man's smirk faltered. His eyes darted past Isaiah down the street. Isaiah noticed it too. Headlights were turning the corner, slow and deliberate, rolling toward the house. He knew those lights. He knew those engines. And suddenly, he knew he wasn't standing alone anymore. The impostors stiffened, sensing the shift, but not yet understanding it. Isaiah didn't move. He simply crossed his arms again and let the faintest smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like you're about to meet some friends of mine," he said, his tone low, steady, almost amused. And in that moment, as 3 vehicles rolled closer, their beams slicing through the dusk, the balance of power shifted, not because the impostors had lost their props, but because real men forged in truth and discipline were about to step onto the street. The taller one finally broke the silence that clung to the porch like damp air. His voice, rehearsed, flattened into a cadence meant to sound official, but hollow to anyone who'd ever known real orders. "Mr. Brooks," he said, squaring his shoulders as if those 3 syllables carried the weight of law. Isaiah gave him nothing in return, no nod, no acknowledgement beyond the steady, unblinking stare that had once made young recruits stumble over their rifles in training. The tall one pushed on his scar, catching the light of the porch lamp. "You are out of compliance. By directive of the Special Enforcement Division, you have 48 hours to vacate this property." The words came out in clipped bursts, like lines memorized from a poorly written script. Isaiah didn't answer immediately. He let the seconds hang, the silence stretching so tight it felt like even the cicadas in the trees had stopped their hum to listen. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. 48 hours, he repeated, tilting his head as though he was tasting the absurdity on his tongue. "To leave my own house." The shorter one stepped forward, then his mirrored shades catching the last smear of sunset, as if he thought reflection could replace authority. He was stocky, thick around the chest, and arms the kind of build that made men think intimidation was as simple as filling space. "That's right," he said, his tone clipped, eager to sound in command. "You're out of compliance. We've been authorized to serve notice. Pack your things. Be gone in 2 days, or we escalate." Isaiah's lips curled into the faintest smile, the kind that came not from humor, but from recognition. He'd seen men like this on every continent, men who thought borrowed bravado and second-hand gear could stand in for discipline. He didn't move from his place at the threshold, didn't flinch when the taller one lifted his clipboard like a weapon of bureaucracy. Paper fluttered under the porch light, a sheet covered in bolded phrases and technical jargon designed to confuse, not clarify. "Notice of violation," it read at the top in a font Isaiah recognized instantly as Times New Roman civilian default, not the precise typeface that carried legal documents. Beneath it were lines about code infractions, mandatory eviction, and noncompliance penalties. Words stacked like barricades but hollow like the sound of an empty magazine slamming against concrete. No seals, no signatures, no letterhead, not even a name. Just filler language stitched together to scare a man into silence. Isaiah let out a short laugh, then not loud, not mocking, but the kind of laugh that carried a sharpened edge, the way steel sings when drawn from its sheath. "You expect me to believe this," he said, reaching out and plucking the page from the tall man's clipboard as casually as if he were grabbing junk mail. He held it up to the porch light, scanning every line with the eye of a man trained to read reports that could mean life or death. "This isn't worth the paper it's printed on," he said flatly, flicking it back toward them. "I've seen forged IDs in Kandahar that looked more convincing than this trash." The tall one bristled, his jaw tightening as though he wasn't used to being called out so directly. He took half a step forward, closing the gap, letting his height loom like a shadow. "We're not here to debate, Mr. Brooks. We're here to enforce. Our directive is clear, 48 hours." The words landed heavy, but Isaiah's face remained carved in stone, unreadable. He folded his arms across his chest, his broad frame blocking the doorway entirely, making it clear they weren't entering so much as standing at the edge of a fortress. "Enforce," Isaiah said, his voice quiet, but cutting the kind of tone that demanded attention. "Enforce? What exactly? Show me the statute. Show me the code. Tell me the division commander who signed this order." "You can't, because there isn't one." The shorter one shifted again, clearly uncomfortable, his hand twitching near the strap of his vest. He thrust his clipboard forward as if pushing the paper into Isaiah's chest could prove his words true. "This document is binding," he insisted. "Non-compliance is subject to removal. You resist, you face consequences." Isaiah's eyes dropped to the paper for a moment, then rose back up to meet the mirrored shades, his gaze so sharp it felt like it could cut through glass. "Consequences," he echoed. "Son, I've walked through villages in the dead of night, with more firepower pointed at me than you could even imagine. Don't stand on my porch and talk to me about consequences." For the first time, hesitation flickered across the impostors' faces. Their act was crumbling at the edges, the script unraveling because it had met a man who didn't play along. But still, they tried to salvage it. The tall one straightened, gripping his clipboard tighter, as if doubling down on the lie could somehow make it real. "Our paperwork is legitimate," he said, though his voice carried a crack, now a small fracture in his performance. "You have 48 hours. After that, we'll handle it our way." Isaiah took a single step forward then, so they had to tilt their heads up to keep eye contact. His presence filled the porch, his voice steady, his words deliberate. "You're right about one thing," he said. "There will be consequences. Not for me, but for you, if you keep pretending that scraps of paper and fake patches give you authority. Real authority doesn't hide behind clipboards. Real authority doesn't crumble under questions. And real authority isn't bought on eBay." The shorter one bristled, his jaw clenching as he muttered, "You don't want to make this harder." But Isaiah only shook his head, his calm demeanor carrying the kind of weight that men who'd never seen combat could never imitate. "You've already made it harder," he said softly, "because you knocked on the wrong door. You thought you'd find someone who'd fold under pressure. Instead, you found a man who's lived through worse than your entire act put together." The taller one smirked again, but it didn't reach his eyes. 48 hours, Mr. Brooks," he repeated, but the words rang thinner, now brittle as glass under strain. He tucked the clipboard back under his arm, trying to reassert control, but the false shine of command had already dulled. And as Isaiah studied them, the truth settled deeper in his chest. These weren't men enforcing law. They were predators, circling desperate for a victim who'd mistake fear for legitimacy. What they didn't realize, not yet, was that they had stumbled into the house of a man who recognized lies the way a soldier recognizes the sound of an empty chamber. And the night was only beginning to turn against them. Isaiah didn't need long, mere seconds were enough for his instincts sharpened over 2 decades of combat tours and command decisions to tell him everything about the men standing on his porch was wrong. It was the radios first. Radios were lifelines in the field pulse beats of entire operations. These ones clipped to their belts were dark. No soft crackle of static. No red diode glow, nothing. Silent props, dangling like ornaments. Then his eyes dropped to the patches, stitched across their chests, in bold white block letters, Special Enforcement Division. To an untrained neighbor, maybe the words would carry weight. But Isaiah knew the difference between fabric that had seen dirt, sand, rain, and years of wear versus the factory-fresh stitching you could buy in bulk for $20 a pair. These vests hadn't known a day of real service. They were clean, too clean, the edges sharp, like they had come straight out of packaging minutes ago. Even the clipboards they gripped like shields betrayed them, cheap plastic holding flimsy pages, with no signatures, no embossed seal, no governing statute cited. It looked less like enforcement and more like a poor forgery. He let the silence stretch his broad frame, filling the doorway, his hands loose at his sides, but ready. He wanted them to talk, to reveal themselves further, to hear the cracks in their act widen with every sentence. Finally, he tilted his head. His voice low, calm, measured like a man who had once spoken orders, over comms in firefights where every syllable mattered. "Who's your commanding officer?" he asked. The words hung in the air like a trap, laid with precision. The tall one, Kyle Mercer, blinked his scar, twitching slightly as his jaw tightened. He hadn't prepared for that. He glanced at his partner, Derek Holt, whose mirrored shades reflected Isaiah's own porch light, but couldn't mask the sudden stiffness in his stance. Isaiah pressed further, stepping one boot half an inch over the threshold, onto the porch boards, the wood creaking under his weight. "Name him," he said, his tone harder now, sharpened steel instead of calm inquiry. "Your CO, the one who signed this order. The man who will answer when I call." Holt cleared his throat, a nervous reflex, but said nothing. Mercer tried to salvage ground, puffing out his chest. "We don't answer to you," he said, voice rising a notch too high. "You're in violation, and we've made that clear." Isaiah's lips curved into a smile, but there was nothing warm in it. Violation of what statute, he shot back. His voice rolled like thunder contained in a narrow space. "Tell me the code. Give me the chapter, the verse. I've seen men in the field who knew every detail of their orders down to the clause because real authority is specific. You can't even name the rule you claim I've broken." The porch fell into silence again, but this time the weight had shifted. The impostors weren't in control anymore. Mercer's eyes darted sideways, as if trying to pull an answer from Holt without saying a word. Holt finally muttered, "Non-compliance Statute 14, though his voice wavered like paper in wind. Isaiah's brow furrowed with mock thoughtfulness, his deep voice carrying the faintest hint of sarcasm. "Non-compliance Statute 14, he repeated. "That's not even a thing. You think I haven't read real regulations? You think a man who spent 20 years executing lawful orders around the world doesn't know the difference between command authority and cosplay?" He stepped closer again, his shadow stretching across their boots. "Let me tell you something about men who knock on doors wearing patches they didn't earn. I can see you. Every detail. Radios switched off. Vests too new. Paperwork that wouldn't pass for a high school project. And here you are trying to tell me I've got 48 hours to abandon the home I've worked my life to build." His voice deepened sharp enough now to cut through whatever illusion they thought they had left. "You came to the wrong house." Mercer tried one last push, his voice rising. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Isaiah's eyes narrowed, and in them lived the reflection of nights when he had stared down men with real weapons, real authority, real power to end lives. "You don't even know what hard is," he said softly. "I've led teams through firefights in villages halfway across the world. I've had seconds to choose between silence and survival, between kicking down a door or waiting long enough to live. And you think waving fake forms at me makes you dangerous? You're not dangerous. You're desperate." He let that land. The air between them grew thick, the impostors shifting their weight as the script slipped from their grip. Holt adjusted his sunglasses, even though the night was already pushing the last traces of daylight away, the movement nervous and unconscious tell. Mercer tightened his hand on the clipboard as if gripping it harder could make it real. Isaiah took note of everything, their shallow breaths, their unsteady stance, the way their eyes flickered too often toward the street as if searching for backup that wasn't coming. Then almost casually Isaiah gestured toward their vests. "You see this patch here, Special Enforcement Division." He said the words slowly, deliberately. "There is no such division. You stitched words onto fabric and thought it would make you someone. But let me be clear, you're no one. And the longer you stand here pretending otherwise, the more obvious it becomes. His words rolled like the slow build of a storm, quiet, but carrying a force that could not be ignored. The impostors didn't answer this time. Their silence said everything. And Isaiah knew as sure as he had known in war zones when the enemy was faltering that these men were seconds away from breaking. Inside his chest, the instincts that had saved him across deserts and oceans sharpened into focus. These weren't officers, weren't even amateurs. They were predators running a scam. And predators who relied on silence and shadows never lasted long when dragged into the light. Isaiah's eyes flicked once more to the street. Headlights were turning the corner. He didn't need to see the vehicles fully yet. He already knew their rhythm, the disciplined crawl, the steady hum of engines driven by men who knew how to arrive prepared. His backup wasn't coming in hours. It was here now. And for the first time since the knocks, Isaiah allowed himself a breath of ease. Because while the impostors had leaned on fake patches, he had something real brothers forged in fire. Kyle Mercer shifted his stance, the wood of the porch creaking faintly under the pressure of his boots as he leaned closer into the space between them. His scar caught the glow of the porch light, like a lightning strike frozen in flesh, and his voice dropped low, the forced gravity of a man trying to convince himself he held power. "Don't do this, Brooks." He said the words slow, almost theatrical, like he'd practiced them in a mirror. "You keep resisting, and it's only going to make things worse. You've got 48 hours to pack your things and walk away. If you don't, we'll handle it our way." The sentence hung heavy, intended as a threat, but Isaiah didn't so much as blink. He had seen real threats lived through firefights where artillery landed meters away, where the hiss of incoming mortars left no time for speeches. Compared to that, Kyle Mercer's words were empty shells, sound without detonation. Isaiah shifted his weight slightly, crossing his arms over his chest, his shoulders broad enough to block the entire doorway, his silhouette cutting a formidable figure against the dim light inside the house. He didn't raise his voice, didn't match aggression with aggression. Instead, he let his calm fill the air like a steady drumbeat. "Make things worse," he repeated softly, almost with curiosity. "Tell me, Mercer, what does worse look like to a man who's already walked through worse than you could imagine? You think standing on my porch with a fake vest and a clipboard is enough to shake me? Son, I've stood in streets where every shadow might hold a trigger. I've walked alleys where one wrong turn meant my whole team didn't come home. If you think worse means a few words and a sheet of paper, then you've already lost." The shorter one, Derek Holt, shifted beside Kyle, his mirrored shades useless now under the dying light of the evening. He adjusted them anyway, as though hiding his eyes could make his bravado believable. "You're testing patience," he snapped, his voice sharper, higher-pitched, betraying nerves. "We've got authority you don't want to tangle with. 48 hours. That's your grace period. You push this any further, and we'll escalate. We'll make sure you regret it." Isaiah's laugh was low, almost inaudible, but it carried the weight of certainty. He stepped forward, closing the gap until the porch boards creaked again, until Kyle and Derek had to lift their chins to meet his gaze. His voice was steady, a current of steel beneath calm waters. "Regret?" he asked. "You don't know the first thing about regret. Regret is carrying names of men who didn't make it back. Regret is standing in front of families and explaining why their sons, their brothers, aren't coming home. That's regret. What you're doing here tonight. This is cowardice in a costume. And I don't bow to cowards." Kyle's jaw twitched. He wasn't used to being challenged, wasn't used to his threats bouncing off a man like pebbles against armor. He leaned in even closer, the smell of cheap cologne sharp in the air. "You think you're untouchable because you've got that military background," he hissed. "But this isn't war. This is enforcement. And if you don't comply, we'll make an example out of you." Isaiah's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move back. Instead, he let the silence thicken, let Kyle hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then slowly, Isaiah tilted his head, speaking with the same calm he had used in briefing rooms before missions. "An example. You don't even realize, do you? You're already the example. The example of how weakness dresses itself up in patches and paper. The example of what happens when men confuse intimidation with authority. And the longer you stand here, the clearer that example becomes, not to me, but to every eye watching." As if on cue, the faint sound of a door creaking open echoed from across the street. A neighbor stepped onto her porch, curious phone in hand. Another window shade shifted a child's face, peering out, before being pulled back by a parent. Kyle noticed. Derek noticed. Their eyes flickered, betraying the unease they tried to hide. The quiet suburban street was no longer theirs to control. Their bluff, their script relied on privacy, on isolating one man in silence. Now that silence was breaking. Kyle straightened, suddenly pulling back just half an inch, his voice rising with frustration. Last warning, he barked, trying to reclaim dominance. 48 hours, Brooks. If you're still here, if you're still standing on this porch, it won't end clean. Isaiah didn't flinch. He let the words wash over him like rain on steel. Then, with deliberate calm, he uncrossed his arms and pointed once slowly toward the end of the street. Headlights turned the corner, 2, then 3 vehicles moving in formation, not rushing, not casual, but steady, deliberate, like men who knew exactly where they were going and why. The hum of engines grew louder, filling the silence. Kyle's words faltered, caught in his throat, as his eyes darted toward the lights. Derek adjusted his glasses again, the gesture now less arrogance and more nervous habit. Isaiah allowed the faintest trace of a smile to break his calm. "You talk about making things worse," he said softly, his voice carrying with quiet authority. "But you don't understand the scale. For you, worse is me refusing to leave. For me, worse is what's waiting at the end of this block. And I promise you it's not a clipboard and a fake patch." The headlights drew closer, engines purring like lions in the dark. The impostors shifted their earlier confidence, bleeding out into restless glances and tightened grips on their props. Isaiah stepped back just half a pace, not in retreat, but to give the approaching presence room to take shape. His voice dropped lower, calm as the eye of a storm. "You thought I was alone. You thought this was easy. But men like me are never alone. Not here. Not ever." The impostors stiffened the last of their bravado, straining against the quiet inevitability rolling down the street. For the first time, Isaiah saw what he had been waiting for. Not arrogance, not bluster, but the first flicker of fear in their eyes. And he knew as surely as he had known in combat zones when an enemy line was about to break that the balance of power had shifted. The night, which had begun with 3 heavy knocks and hollow threats, was no longer theirs to control. Isaiah straightened his frame, filling the doorway once more, his presence towering unshaken. "You wanted to make things worse," he said, his voice a steady echo against the quiet street. "Congratulations. You just did." The growl of engines grew louder, not rushed like teenagers racing through the neighborhood, not casual like parents coming home late from dinner, but steady, deliberate, the sound of men who had learned long ago that arriving with purpose was as much a statement as any weapon. Isaiah didn't turn his head. He didn't need to. He knew those engines knew their rhythm, the way a soldier knows the cadence of his own breathing under fire. 3 vehicles rolled down the block in formation, headlights cutting through the Carolina dusk like blades. Kyle Mercer and Derek Holt stiffened their shoulders, tensing their eyes flicking nervously toward the glow. For a moment, their earlier bravado faltered, the swagger of cheap costumes thinning under the weight of something they hadn't prepared for. Isaiah stood tall in the doorway, his arms loose at his sides, his jaw set, his frame casting a long shadow across the porch. His lips curved into the faintest, most deliberate smile. "You asked what worse looks like," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough for them to hear. "Worse is here." The first SUV slowed to a stop at the curb, its engine cutting with precision. Doors opened, and boots hit pavement with the same rhythm they once had stepping out of helicopters onto hostile soil. Marcus Hill stepped out first, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence heavy with the calm of a man who had spent half his life in command. His beard was flecked with gray now, but his eyes still carried the steel that had held squads together under fire. Behind him came Andre Carter, leaner, his movements sharp and efficient, the kind of man who scanned every angle, every shadow, even in a quiet neighborhood street. From the second vehicle stepped Victor Lane. Barrel-chested, his expression quiet, but his stare piercing, the type of man who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. And last came Thomas Reed, the youngest of the group, but no less seasoned, his walk steady, his gaze cold, the calm predator who had once been the sharp edge of their operations. They didn't need to shout, didn't need to posture. Their silence alone carried more weight than Mercer's clipboard ever could. The impostors shifted, their eyes darting between each man as they spread out across the edge of the lawn, their formation unspoken but precise, the kind of alignment only years of training could create. The neighbors who had been peeking nervously from windows and porches now leaned further out, their curiosity sharpened by the sudden arrival of men whose presence felt different, measured, controlled, undeniable. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice low, but cutting through the tense air like a blade through cloth. "Cal," he said, using Isaiah's old call sign, the nickname that had followed him through deployments across oceans. "What's going on here?" Isaiah didn't turn from Mercer and Holt. He kept his eyes locked on them, his voice calm as he answered. "These two claim I've got 48 hours to clear out of my own home. Say they're from something called the Special Enforcement Division. Brought fake paperwork, fake patches, fake everything." Andre Carter let out a low whistle, shaking his head as he scanned the impostors up and down. "Special Enforcement Division," he repeated, his tone flat with disbelief. "Never heard of it. You boys mind showing us some real credentials?" Mercer's jaw tightened, his scar twitching again. He tried to stand taller, tried to summon the same authority that had begun slipping away minutes earlier. "This doesn't concern you," he said sharply. "This is official business. Step aside." Victor Lane stepped forward, then his shadow stretching long across the grass, his arms folded over his chest. "You just made it our business," he said, his voice calm but iron-edged. The impostors faltered, their bluff eroding faster now under the weight of 4 men who had stood shoulder to shoulder, with Isaiah in places far harsher than this quiet Charlotte street. Thomas Reed tilted his head, studying the stitching on their vests, the brand of the radios, the cheap plastic of the clipboards. He chuckled once, low and humorless. "Stitching's too clean," he said. "Radios aren't even on. Those patches look like they were sewn yesterday. You boys think this is a joke." Holt bristled, trying to mask his unease with sharp words. "We're not here to debate uniforms," he snapped. "We're here to enforce compliance." Andre stepped closer, his phone in his hand, now recording deliberately, raising it just enough for the impostors to see the lens capturing every second. "Then name the compliance code," he said, his tone smooth, steady. "Shouldn't be hard, right? Quote it. Give us the statute." The impostors hesitated, the pause stretching too long, too naked. Neighbors began to murmur, some whispering to one another, others lifting their own phones to record. Mercer swallowed hard, his voice finally spilling out brittle around the edges. "Non-compliance, Statute 14, he muttered. Marcus laughed once sharp and cutting a sound that carried down the street. "Non-compliance, Statute 14, he repeated. "That's the best you've got. I've seen mission orders scribbled on the back of napkins that carried more weight than that garbage." He stepped closer, his eyes hard. "You walked onto the wrong street tonight." The air thickened heavy with the weight of the shift. Mercer and Holt had come with a script of intimidation, with the expectation that a man alone would fold under the costume of authority. But now they were facing not one man, but 5 brothers bound not just by service, but by trust. Men who didn't flinch at words, meant to scare. The impostors' voices, once sharp, now cracked at the edges, their threats blunted by silence that pressed harder than any shout. Isaiah finally unfolded his arms, stepping fully onto the porch, his boots thudding against the wood. He walked down the steps, closing the space between himself and the impostors until Marcus, Andre, Victor, and Thomas flanked him like a wall. His voice was calm, his words steady. "You thought I'd be an easy target," he said. "You thought you could knock on my door, throw a few phrases around and watch me crumble. But you didn't check who lives here. You didn't know I wasn't alone." The impostors exchanged glances, their confidence eroding visibly now. Holt shifted his clipboard nervously, his grip tightening his mirrored shades, hiding eyes that darted for an escape. Mercer clenched his jaw, but the scar on his face twitched, betraying nerves. Victor leaned forward, his voice low but carrying the kind of voice that left no room for doubt. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to put those clipboards down. You're going to turn around, get in that SUV, and leave. Or you're going to stay, and we'll call the real authorities. Either way, this ends tonight." The impostors hesitated, caught between pride and the unraveling reality that their performance was collapsing in front of an audience growing by the minute. Neighbors lined porches, now phones raised high whispers, carrying across the block like wind through trees. What had begun as a private confrontation was becoming a public spectacle, one that no patch, no fake paper, no hollow threat could survive. Isaiah glanced toward his brothers, their formation silent but strong, their presence radiating the same discipline they had once carried into missions across seas. He felt the weight of their loyalty, the reassurance of men who understood without needing words. And in that moment, the impostors weren't staring down a single homeowner anymore. They were facing a unit, a wall of steel, forged over decades of service. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The porch that had once felt like contested ground was now claimed the air charged with the certainty of men who had stared down far greater dangers and survived. The impostors could feel it. And Isaiah knew as surely as he had known in combat, when the enemy line was breaking, that Mercer and Holt had already lost. The impostors should have left. Then Isaiah could see it in their posture, the way Mercer's shoulders stiffened under the weight of eyes. He hadn't planned for the way Holt's fingers drummed restlessly against the edge of his clipboard, tapping like a nervous tell he didn't know how to control. They should have retreated into the dark SUV, idling at the curb, driven away, vanished into the night like shadows that couldn't stand daylight. But pride is a dangerous fuel, and theirs still burned hot. Mercer straightened his back, lifting his chin, as if height alone could compensate for the collapse of their authority. We've made our position clear." He barked, his voice louder, now sharper, trying to reassert control over a stage that no longer belonged to him. "This is official business. You are out of compliance. Brooks and your friends don't change that. You resist, and there will be consequences." Marcus Hill let out a short, humorless laugh, a sound that snapped through the air like a rifle bolt. He stepped forward, his frame casting a shadow that met Mercer's squarely. "Consequences," Marcus echoed. "I see nothing here but two men playing dress-up with gear they don't understand. You think these vests make you soldiers? You think radios switched off on your belts make you look official? I've worn real gear, son. And I can tell you, this every stitch on you is fake. I've seen cleaners sewing on surplus store mannequins." Holt bristled, his jaw tightening as he adjusted his mirrored shades, though the fading light rendered them useless. "We're not here to argue uniforms," he snapped. "We're here to enforce compliance, and you're interfering." His voice cracked at the last word, thin around the edges. Victor Lane stepped in, then his arms folded across his barrel chest, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Enforce what?" he asked, simply, tilting his head like a teacher, waiting for an answer to an obvious question. "Name the statute. Quote the code. Give me the number, the clause, the law you claim gives you the right to stand on this porch and make threats. If this is official business, you'll have it ready. Go on. Enlighten us." The silence that followed stretched too long. Mercer opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words failing him before they could form. Holt shifted his weight, gripping his clipboard tighter, the paper crumpling slightly under his fingers. Isaiah saw the hesitation, the moment when a con man realizes the script has run out. Andre Carter, who had been quiet until now, lifted his phone higher, its small red light blinking as it recorded. "Good," he said, his voice steady, almost clinical. "We've got that on video, your silence, your hesitation, your inability to name a single law. Every second you stand here bluffing, the whole world will see it." He angled the phone deliberately, catching Mercer's scarred face, Holt's mirrored shades, their cheap patches, their dead radios. "Smile for the camera, gentlemen. This is your legacy now. That did it." Mercer's face flushed with anger, a deep red blooming under the porch light. "Turn that off," he barked, taking a half step forward. "You can't record us. This is classified." Andre cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Classified? What's classified about a fake vest and a clipboard with no signatures? I've seen classified. I've handled it, lived it, breathed it. And let me tell you, this isn't even close. This is fraud, plain and simple. And now it's documented." The impostors faltered, their bluff bleeding out under the weight of calm precision. And then, as if on cue, the street began to change. Doors creaked open. Porch lights flicked on. Curtains twitched as neighbors stepped out into the evening air, drawn by the tension thick as thunderclouds. Mrs. Delgado from across the street wrapped a shawl around her shoulders as she whispered to her husband, her phone already in hand. Eric Johnson, a few houses down, stepped onto his lawn, his teenage son beside him, both lifting their phones to record. More doors opened, more phones appeared. In less than 2 minutes, half the block was awake and watching the quiet suburban street transformed into an impromptu stage where truth and lies collided under the judgment of community eyes. Holt noticed first, his jaw tightening as he muttered under his breath, "This isn't good." Mercer shot him a sharp look, trying to keep the cracks from widening. "Stay focused," he hissed, then raised his voice again, loud enough for the crowd now gathering. "Citizens, step back into your homes. This is an official operation. "Do not interfere." The words backfired. Neighbors who had been hesitant stepped closer instead, their phones lifting higher, their whispers sharpening into louder commentary. "Official Operation," one man muttered. "What division? I've never heard of them." A woman's voice called out, "Why don't you show badges if you're real?" Another neighbor shouted, "I know what the local police uniforms look like, and that ain't it." Laughter rippled through the group, small, but cutting, the kind of laughter that strips away authority, like paint from rusted steel. Isaiah stood steady, his brothers flanking him in a silent wall, their formation unspoken but perfect. He didn't need to speak. The impostors were undoing themselves with every passing second. Mercer tried again, his voice louder, sharper, but it carried desperation now, the edges fraying. "You don't understand," he said, his hand tightening around his clipboard as though it were a shield. "We're authorized. You interfere, and you'll face charges too." Victor stepped forward, then his eyes narrowing, his voice calm enough to slice. "Authorized by who?" he asked. "Name him. Give us a phone number, an office, a chain of command." "You can't, because there isn't one. You're not authorized. You're improvising." Andre's phone caught every word, the impostor's silence, the crowd's murmurs, the unraveling performance of two men who had walked onto the wrong porch. Isaiah could see it now, the shift of power, the way fear was crawling into their stance. Their earlier threats had been loud, but fear makes men quiet. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice booming just enough to carry down the street, steady, unwavering. "You came here thinking intimidation would be enough. You thought a vest and a few memorized lines could make a man like him fold? But you forgot the first rule of power: it only works if people believe it. And nobody here believes you anymore." The words hit like a hammer, echoed by murmurs of agreement from the crowd. A neighbor called out, "Yeah, we don't buy it." Another added, "Call the cops." Phones angled higher, red lights blinking like fireflies, each one capturing the impostor's humiliation in high definition. Mercer's composure cracked. He took a step back, his eyes darting toward the SUV at the curb, his pride caught between retreat and stubbornness. Holt bristled, his lips curling into a sneer, but his hand trembled as he gripped the clipboard tighter. Isaiah's instincts sharpened. He'd seen this before in war zones, in ambushes, men on the brink of breaking men, desperate to salvage control they no longer had. Isaiah stepped forward, then his presence towering, his voice calm but commanding. "You said worse was coming if I resisted. I stood my ground. I called your bluff. And now, look around. What do you see? Dozens of witnesses. Cameras rolling. Every flaw on your vest, every fake word on your paper, every lie you've told, it's all recorded. This isn't your stage anymore. It's theirs." He gestured toward the neighbors, toward the cameras raised high. "And they've already judged you." The impostors had no answer. Their silence was louder than any denial could have been. The standoff was no longer between two men in fake vests and one man on his porch. It was between impostors and an entire street, between fraud and truth, between hollow power and the immovable calm of men who knew what real authority looked like. And in that moment, under the glow of porch lights and the steady hum of cameras, the impostor's performance collapsed. The street had claimed the truth. The balance had shifted. And Isaiah knew the fight was far from over, but the battle for fear was already won. It began as whispers soft as the breeze that moved through the sycamores lining the quiet Charlotte Street. But soon, those whispers turned into a current that no threat could silence. Mrs. Delgado, wrapped in her shawl, though the air was still warm, stood at the edge of her driveway. Her eyes narrowed at the impostors on Isaiah's porch. She clutched her phone like a lifeline, raising it slowly, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from a rising sense of duty. "Record everything," she muttered to her husband, who had stepped out beside her. His brow furrowed as he stared at the bold letters stitched across the impostors' vests, Special Enforcement Division. Just 3 doors down, Eric Johnson, a tall man in his 50s, had already lifted his phone high, the small red circle of the camera glowing as he whispered to his teenage son, "Keep steady. Don't miss a second." One by one, porch lights flickered, on shadows shifted, and neighbors emerged from their homes drawn by the gravity of confrontation, pulled by the instinct to witness when truth was on the line. Within minutes, what had started as 3 heavy knocks on Isaiah Brooks's door had turned into a gathering of eyes, lenses, and voices, the entire block forming an impromptu jury under the fading light of dusk. The impostors had come armed with intimidation, with scripted words and counterfeit patches, but intimidation dies in daylight. And daylight now came not from the sun, but from dozens of glowing screens raised in the dark. Phones angled high, capturing Mercer's scarred face as he shouted his hollow threats, catching the reflection of Holt's mirrored shades as he tried to puff his chest against men whose calm made his bravado look like desperation. Each blink of a red recording light was a nail in their performance's coffin, each whisper from the crowd a verdict passed before law could even arrive. "Look at their radios," one neighbor whispered. "Not even on." Another voice followed louder now. "Those papers look fake. No signatures, nothing official." The murmurs spread like wildfire, weaving into a tapestry of disbelief, unraveling the impostors' carefully rehearsed act thread by thread. Isaiah felt the energy shift, saw how the impostors' eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd, how Mercer's jaw tightened as if he could feel the weight of every lens pointed at him. Holt adjusted his glasses again, the motion jittery, betraying the nerves beneath his sneer. Isaiah didn't need to move. The community was doing the work, now stripping away the costume of authority with nothing more than their presence, their phones, their voices. He caught Mrs. Delgado's gaze for a moment, the determination etched on her face, and gave her the faintest nod. She nodded back as if to say, "We've got this too." Eric Johnson raised his voice, then no longer a whisper but a challenge, his tone carrying across the gathering crowd. "If you're real, show your badges." The words struck like a bell. Heads turned. More voices joined in, emboldened. "Yeah, where are your IDs?" another neighbor shouted. "Who sent you?" asked a woman clutching her child close, but refusing to go back inside. The impostors shifted uncomfortably, caught in a crossfire of questions. They couldn't answer their earlier confidence leaking away like water through cracked stone. Mercer tried to double down his voice, booming louder, sharper, desperate to reclaim ground. Everyone stepped back. This is official business. But the declaration, once sharp, was drowned under the tide of disbelief. Laughter broke from somewhere in the crowd, short-cutting, contagious. A ripple of chuckles spread through the neighbors, not cruel but decisive, the kind of laughter that signals the collapse of pretense. Nothing unravels false authority faster than ridicule, and the impostors were becoming not feared figures, but punchlines, their vests and clipboards reduced to costumes, in the eyes of a community no longer fooled. Andre Carter lifted his phone higher, his calm voice narrating like a reporter. "We've asked them 3 times now for statutes for commanding officers for IDs. Nothing. Just silence and empty threats. These aren't enforcers, they're scammers." His words, captured and echoed through the neighborhood, turned the impostor's silence into a confession. Victor Lane folded his arms, his stance broad and immovable. Marcus Hill shook his head, letting his voice carry down the street. "Look at them. They thought one man would be easy to scare. But one man isn't alone when his community stands behind him. Isaiah felt the words strike true, felt the pride swell in his chest, not for himself, but for the sight of neighbors stepping out of isolation, standing shoulder to shoulder, in the face of intimidation. The impostors had planned for fear, but what they faced now was unity, and unity was louder than any threat. Mrs. Delgado raised her phone higher, her voice trembling, but strong as she called out, "We see you for what you are, fraudsters." The word rang out clear and sharp, echoed by murmurs and shouts from others in the crowd. Holt's sneer faltered his lips, twitching as if he wanted to fire back, but couldn't summon the words. Mercer's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides, but every move he made was recorded, every twitch preserved on dozens of screens that would soon find their way to social media, to news outlets, to the eyes of anyone willing to see. The impostors' intimidation had become humiliation, each second dragging them deeper into the pit they dug for themselves. What had been private theater was now public collapse, their script shredded by laughter, their performance drowned by voices calling for truth. Isaiah finally stepped forward again, his voice low, but carrying with the weight of command. "Look around," he said, his words directed at Mercer and Holt, but meant for everyone within earshot. "You don't hold power here. Not anymore. Every phone, every voice, every witness, this is real authority. And it doesn't wear fake patches or hide behind silence." The crowd murmured in agreement, voices rising a chorus of solidarity. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now nodded to each other, strangers bound suddenly by the shared knowledge that they had stared down a lie together. Children peeked from behind their parents' eyes wide, learning in real time that fear only wins when people stand alone. Mercer tried one final shout, his voice cracking with the weight of desperation. "This isn't over. You'll regret interfering." But his words landed flat, swallowed by the hum of phones, the laughter of neighbors, the calm presence of Isaiah and his brothers standing unshaken. The impostors weren't feared anymore. They were outnumbered, out-recorded, out-exposed. And as Isaiah looked across the crowd at Mrs. Delgado, with her steady hand at Eric Johnson, guiding his son's camera, at the dozens of neighbors who had stepped out of their silence, he knew the truth. The impostors had lost the moment the community decided to watch, because authority wasn't in threats. It wasn't in costumes. It wasn't in cheap radios or hollow words. Authority lived in truth, in unity, in the collective strength of people who refused to bow. And tonight, under the glow of porch lights and phone screens, the community had claimed its authority, and the impostors, once so sure of their script, were nothing more than actors stripped bare under an audience they could never control. The wail of sirens cut through the humid Carolina night like the cry of judgment itself, a sharp rising pitch that made heads turn all down the block. Blue and red lights spilled against the brick facades of houses, flashing across windshields, painting the impostors' black SUV in stuttering bursts of color. The crowd parted instinctively, neighbors drawing their children close, but refusing to go inside because they knew the climax had come. Mercer and Holt, who had once strutted onto Isaiah Brooks's porch with the confidence of predators, now stood frozen, their earlier threats evaporating into the night air, as two patrol cars boxed them in with the precision of a trap snapping shut. Tires screeched lightly as doors opened, and from the first cruiser stepped Sergeant Wallace, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s, with a jaw set like granite, and a flashlight already sweeping across the scene. From the second car came Officer Green, younger, but sharp-eyed, his movements, quick, deliberate, every step, carrying the steady readiness of a man who'd seen liars wilt under a single direct question. "Hands where I can see them." Wallace's voice boomed, years of command woven into every syllable. His words weren't a request. They were law taking shape in sound. The impostors hesitated, Mercer glancing at Holt, clutching his clipboard, as though it could shield him. Now, Wallace barked again, and the force in his tone made Holt's fingers twitch, dropping the papers to the ground, where they fluttered across the grass like scraps of a broken play. Both men raised their hands slowly, but it was already too late. The neighborhood had seen their bluff collapse, and now real authority was here to finish it. Officer Green circled wide his flashlight beam, cutting across their vests, lingering on the patches. Special Enforcement Division, he muttered, his brows furrowing. He pressed the fabric with his fingers, tugging slightly at the stitching. These aren't regulation. Not even close. He flicked the radio clipped to Mercer's vest. Silence. He flicked again. Still nothing. Dead radios, Green said flatly, his voice carrying to the watching crowd. They're props. Sergeant Wallace stooped, picking up one of the discarded sheets of paper. He held it under the flashlight beam, his eyes scanning the bolded jargon violation of Code 14B. Mandatory eviction. His mouth curled into a dry, humorless smile. This isn't official paperwork. My grandson's school assignments look more legitimate than this. No seals, no signatures, no case numbers. Just nonsense. He turned the paper around for the crowd to see, and murmurs rose like a wave, neighbors shaking their heads, some even chuckling under their breath. Isaiah stood with his arms folded, his brothers in a line beside him, silent sentinels, as truth unfolded. He said nothing he didn't need to. Everything he had claimed, every question he had demanded, was now confirmed by real law, by men who carried not just badges, but legitimacy backed by statute and training. Mercer tried one last time to salvage ground his voice, breaking with desperation. We were authorized, he shouted, his scar twitching as he strained against the humiliation. This is bigger than you know. Sergeant Wallace's head turned slowly, his gaze hard, unblinking. He stepped close, the flashlight beam cutting across Mercer's face, highlighting every crack in his performance. Authorized by who, Wallace asked. The words were simple, but they landed heavy. The kind of question men like Mercer could never answer. Silence stretched. Holt's lips parted, but no words came. Green tilted his head, smirking faintly. Thought so, he said, then reached behind Mercer, unclipping the vest with a tug that made the straps snap free. He held it up for the crowd, turning it inside out. You can order these online for $40. Stitchings, clean, fabrics new. Real gear doesn't look like this. It carries wear-tear history. This is just a costume. Laughter rippled through the neighbors, louder now, cutting deeper. Mercer's face burned red. Holt's jaw clenched, as though he could bite back the humiliation. Wallace dropped the fake papers onto the hood of the SUV with a slap that echoed like a gavel. Impersonating law enforcement, he said, his tone heavy with finality. That's a felony. Threatening a homeowner, that's intimidation. Coming here dressed like this, waving this trash paperwork. Gentlemen, your night just ended. Cuff them, Wallace ordered. Officer Green moved with practiced efficiency, pulling Holt's arms behind him, as the click of steel echoed in the night. Holt tried to protest, his voice shrill, now the arrogance stripped away. This isn't over. You don't know who you're messing with. But Green only tightened the cuffs with a sharp snap. Save it for booking, he said coolly. Mercer resisted longer, his pride, fighting even as Wallace's steady grip forced his hands back. You're interfering with federal business, he shouted, his voice cracking, as the words rang false against the laughter of neighbors. Wallace leaned close, his voice low, dangerous. Federal business. "Son, the only business you've got now is with a county judge. And I promise you, he won't buy your act either." The crowd erupted into murmurs and cheers, neighbors clapping, some whistling, as the impostors were pulled toward the cruisers. Phones captured every second the fake patches, the bogus papers, the cuffs snapping shut. Mrs. Delgado wiped at her eyes, muttering to herself, "Justice, finally." Eric Johnson lowered his phone long enough to clap Isaiah on the back. "You held firm," he said, his voice thick with respect. "You showed us how to stand." Isaiah gave him a nod, his gaze steady on the impostors being pushed into the back seats of the cruisers. He felt no triumph, no gloating, only relief, a deep, quiet relief that the con was over. That truth had walked onto the street, not with vests and clipboards, but with sirens, badges, and law. His brothers stood silently beside him, their eyes reflecting the same thought: this battle had ended clean, but it could have gone so differently. As the cruiser's doors slammed shut, Wallace turned back toward the crowd, his voice carrying. "We'll need statements," he said, gesturing toward the neighbors. "Everything you saw, everything you recorded, it'll help lock this down tight." Phones lifted again, volunteers, nodding voices rising in agreement. Green adjusted his belt, glancing at Isaiah. "Good thing you didn't buy the act. Some folks might have. You saved yourself, and you saved this block." Isaiah finally let his arms uncross, the tension in his shoulders easing. His eyes swept the crowd, neighbors he had known for years, but had never seen stand together like this. Tonight, they had not only witnessed, but acted their phones and voices, dismantling lies before they could spread. He looked at Mrs. Delgado, still holding her phone steady, at Eric Johnson and his son, faces lit by both pride and disbelief, at the line of porches filled with people who had stepped out of silence into solidarity. And he knew then this was more than the end of a scam. This was the rebirth of a community's confidence, the proof that no man, no lie could stand when truth was shared by many. The cruisers pulled away slowly, lights flashing, sirens muted now, carrying Mercer and Holt toward the reckoning that awaited them in a station where their act would hold no ground. The street buzzed with low voices, the hum of conversation, the release of tension. Children whispered to each other about the sight of fake cops being hauled away. Parents spoke in hushed tones about how easily a scam could have turned dangerous. And in the middle of it all stood Isaiah Brooks, flanked by Marcus Andre Victor, and Thomas, a wall of calm strength that needed no vest, no patch, no badge to command respect. For the first time since the heavy knocks had rattled his door, Isaiah allowed himself to breathe fully, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He looked at his brothers, each one silent but present, and then at the community that had just proven its strength. Tonight, the impostors had been cuffed. But more importantly, tonight, the street had learned that unity, vigilance, and truth would always drown out fraud, no matter how bold the costume. And Isaiah knew this was only the beginning of the lessons to come. 3 days later, the little recreation hall at the end of Maplewood Drive was packed tighter than anyone could remember. The place usually held birthday parties, Zumba classes, and the occasional bake sale, but on that Wednesday evening it became a courtroom of sorts, not with judges or gavels, but with neighbors who wanted answers, reassurance and recognition for what they had lived through. Folding chairs squeaked as people shifted into rows, their voices overlapping in low murmurs until the room vibrated with the buzz of shared memory. Some still clutched their phones, replaying the videos they had recorded the night Isaiah Brooks and his old SEAL teammates had faced down the impostors. Others had printouts of the Concord Gazette article, clipped neatly in hand, the headline, "Bold Men Arrested for Impersonating Enforcement Officers in Charlotte Neighborhood." Every eye seemed to gravitate to the front row, where Isaiah sat flanked by Marcus Hill, Andre Carter, Victor Lane, and Thomas Reed. They hadn't asked for the spotlight, but it found them anyway, the weight of the community's gratitude pressing on their shoulders. Patricia Landon, head of the neighborhood, who had nothing to do with the impostors, but had carried the weight of calming shaken residents afterward, stood at the podium with a microphone that squealed before settling. Her hair was pinned back, her voice strong but touched with emotion. "We all know why we're here," she began. "3 nights ago, this neighborhood faced something we never imagined, strangers in fake uniforms threatening one of our own, trying to scare him into leaving his home. They thought intimidation would work. But what they didn't expect was resistance, first from Isaiah, and then from his brothers, and then finally from all of us." Applause rose, hesitant at first, then building into a steady wave. Isaiah shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the sound, but Marcus nudged his shoulder, muttering low enough only he could hear, "Take it, Cal. You earned it." Isaiah gave a small, reluctant nod, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Patricia continued, "It's easy to think scams like this are rare, that they happen to someone else, somewhere else. But they came here. They knocked on our doors. And they nearly got away with it until we stood together. That's the lesson we can't forget." She glanced down at her notes, then back up. "Tonight we're forming something new. Not a patrol, not an armed force, just neighbors watching out for neighbors. A community watch built on communication, verification, and solidarity. Because no piece of paper, no fake patch, no loud threat will ever mean more than the truth we share together." The room stirred with murmurs of agreement. Mrs. Delgado, who sat a few rows back, wrapped again in her shawl, raised her hand timidly before being called on. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. "When I stepped out that night, I was scared. I thought, what if they turn on me? But then I saw Isaiah standing there, calm, steady, and I realized if one of us stands, the rest can too. That's what gave me the courage to lift my phone." She paused, her eyes glistening. "And now I know I'll never stand alone again." Eric Johnson followed, his deep voice cutting through the crowd. "My son recorded almost the whole thing. He told me afterward, 'Dad, I didn't know neighbors could do that, stand together like soldiers.' He learned something that night. We all did." Heads nodded, whispers of agreement moving through the rows like a tide. When Patricia asked if Isaiah wanted to speak, he stood slowly, towering above the seated rows, his presence commanding but humble. He cleared his throat, scanning the faces in front of him, not just neighbors, but witnesses to a truth he carried deep. "I didn't plan for any of this." He began, his voice low but resonant. 3 knocks on my door, and suddenly my porch turned into a battlefield of words. But I wasn't alone. My brothers arrived, and then you arrived. Phones came up, voices came out, and together you did what no fake badge or hollow threat could overcome. You showed them the power of unity. He paused, his gaze steady. "I spent 20 years in the Navy. I've seen men try to control villages with fear, try to silence truth with weapons and uniforms. And I've seen those same men crumble when communities refuse to bow. Real authority isn't in patches or vests or radios you buy online. Real authority is in truth. It's in discipline, the kind that keeps you steady when someone tries to shake you. And it's in unity, neighbors standing together, refusing to be divided or intimidated." The room was silent, every eye locked on him. He let the silence breathe before finishing. "That night, they thought I was one man. But they learned quick I wasn't. I had my brothers, and I had all of you. And that's what we'll carry forward. Together." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing off the hall's low ceiling, rolling like surf against the walls. Isaiah lowered his eyes, the corners of his mouth tightening into the faintest smile, not pride, but relief. He sat down, and Marcus clapped him on the back again, this time with no words needed. After the meeting, sign-up sheets passed hand to hand. Neighbors scribbled names, numbers, emails, each pen stroke a promise to watch, to verify, to protect one another. Teenagers offered to manage a shared group chat. Retirees volunteered to organize contact lists. Eric Johnson suggested a schedule for walking the block in pairs at dusk, not policing, just being present. Mrs. Delgado offered to check on elderly residents who lived alone. What had been a collection of homes was becoming something tighter, something stronger, a community not of proximity, but of choice. Later that night, as the crowd thinned and folding chairs scraped back into stacks, Isaiah lingered by the door of the hall. The laughter of children echoed outside as families walked home together, the night calm again. He looked at Marcus, Andre Victor, and Thomas, his old brothers-in-arms, who stood nearby with the easy camaraderie of men who had shared foxholes and firefights. Marcus grinned. "Not bad for a retirement mission, Cal." Andre chuckled. "Better food than overseas, too." Victor only shook his head, his deep voice rumbling. Unity wins again. Thomas leaned against the wall, his expression calm, his tone certain. Fear only wins when people stand alone. That night proved it. Isaiah stepped outside, the cool air brushing his face, the street lamps glowing along Maplewood Drive. He thought of the impostors in their cells, stripped of patches and clipboards, their scam dissolved under the weight of truth. He thought of the neighbors lifting their phones, their voices, their courage. And he thought of the simple lesson his father had once drilled into him as a boy: real authority never has to overcompensate. That night had proved it again. Authority wasn't a costume, it was a covenant, a bond of trust carried by communities willing to stand. As he walked home, the lights from porches winked on one by one, each house a beacon, each family a reminder. And Isaiah knew deep in his chest that no knock, no threat, no impostor could ever shake that bond again. Because unity once awakened does not sleep. America. The story you just heard on that quiet street in Charlotte is not only about one man, one porch, or one neighborhood, it's about all of us. Commander Isaiah Brooks, a black veteran who gave 20 years of his life to the Navy SEALs, stood calm when two men with fake vests and fake papers tried to strip him of his home. But here's the lesson he didn't win that night alone. He won because his brothers arrived. He won because Mrs. Delgado lifted her phone. He won because Eric Johnson and his son raised their voices. He won because truth walked out of houses and stood shoulder to shoulder until fear had no place to hide. That is a picture of America at its best. In every city from Charlotte to Chicago, in every small town and cul-de-sac from Maine to California, scams, lies, and intimidation thrive when people stay silent. But when we decide to stand together, when we verify before we believe, when we question authority that doesn't ring true, we protect more than property. We protect freedom. Real authority is not in patches bought online or radios clipped to belts. It is in truth, in discipline, in the unity of people who refuse to bow to fear. So here's the call to action: never surrender your ground to lies. Trust your instincts, trust your community, and always report, and resist when something feels wrong. Remember, 48 hours is how long the impostors thought Isaiah would need to crumble. Instead, in less than 10 minutes, an entire street stood up and ended the fraud. If that doesn't inspire you, nothing will. And if you believe more Americans need to hear lessons like this, lessons about courage, vigilance, and unity, then help us spread the word. Hit that subscribe button right now, drop a like, so the story reaches further, and share this video with at least 3 friends or family members before tonight ends. Together we can turn one block's lesson into a national reminder. Fear only wins when we stand alone, but truth always wins when we stand together.